In a windowless office sat a man feared by both allies and enemies. On the desk before him lay a top-level dossier, a photograph of a woman from America, and an image from the other side of the world. This man did not command an army, had no divisions under his name. Yet he overthrew governments, reshaped nations, and turned enemies into allies using only one thing: a deep understanding of the human mind. He wore no uniform, but influenced the course of war more than generals. His methods unsettled even his own colleagues. He staged the appearance of a mythical creature to break the morale of insurgents. He lived a double life, hiding a romantic relationship that lasted nearly 30 years. He built nations out of chaos, convinced entire populations to abandon their homes not from fear, but from faith. He once proposed a public vision of a Messiah in the skies, and that was just one of dozens of his plans. But his brilliance was rejected. His ideas were dismissed. And when the real war began, no one wanted to hear from him. Why are there no streets named after him? Why did his methods first succeed perfectly, only to be discarded with disastrous consequences? What did he understand about war that even presidents failed to grasp? Don't forget to like, leave a comment, and subscribe. You are not here by accident. Most legends begin in shadows. Edward Lansdale's story begins in a Detroit advertising agency, where a young copywriter was learning the dark arts of persuasion. Born into a Christian Science family in 1908, Lansdale grew up believing in the power of ideas to reshape reality. His father had built Napa Auto Parts from nothing, then mysteriously maintained 2 families in 2 different cities, a pattern that would echo strangely through his son's later life. But it was in Los Angeles, crafting campaigns for breakfast cereals and soap powder, that Lansdale discovered his true calling. He could make people believe anything, not through lies, but through understanding what they already wanted to believe. When World War II erupted, the Office of Strategic Services, precursor to the CIA, noticed this peculiar talent. They didn't send Lansdale to exotic locations or dangerous missions. Instead, they gave him perhaps the most valuable assignment of all: interviewing ordinary Americans returning from vacations abroad. A businessman back from Geneva, a teacher who'd spent summer in Switzerland, a photographer with rolls of film from occupied France. Lansdale would sit across from them in nondescript government offices, asking gentle questions, listening to stories, studying photographs that seemed innocent but revealed the machinery of war. He was learning to read between the lines of human nature itself. And somewhere in those quiet conversations, a revolutionary was being born. 1950. The Korean peninsula burns while communist insurgents threaten to overrun the Philippines. America faces a terrible choice: spread its military even thinner, or watch another domino fall to the red tide. The Pentagon's solution was unprecedented. Instead of divisions of soldiers, they would send one man. A former advertising executive with an unusual understanding of human psychology and a briefcase full of unconventional ideas. Edward Lansdale arrived in Manila to find chaos. The Hooks, communist guerrillas hiding in the mountains, controlled vast swaths of countryside. Government forces were corrupt, brutal, and losing. Traditional military wisdom suggested years of bloody jungle warfare lay ahead. But Lansdale saw something else entirely. He saw a man named Ramon Magsaysay, a former rebel who understood both sides of the conflict. More importantly, he saw an opportunity to turn everything the communists thought they knew about revolution against them. The first operation sounds like something from a horror film. Lansdale's team captured a communist fighter at the rear of a patrol. They punctured his neck with 2 small wounds, drained his blood, and hung the body where his comrades would find it. When the patrol returned searching for their missing man, they discovered what appeared to be the work of the aswang, a legendary vampire demon from Filipino folklore. The entire unit fled in terror, abandoning weapons and supplies. Word spread through the mountains like wildfire. The aswang was hunting communists, but psychological warfare was only the beginning. Lansdale's true genius lay in understanding that insurgencies aren't defeated by superior firepower. They're defeated by superior ideas. He convinced Magsaysay to run for president, then crafted a campaign slogan that swept across the Philippines like a wildfire. Magsaysay is my guy. It worked. The election was clean, decisive, and devastating to communist hopes. The Huk rebellion collapsed not from military pressure, but from political irrelevance. An entire insurgency had been neutralized for the cost of one man's salary and a few clever tricks. Washington was amazed. They had just saved a country for, as Lansdale would later joke, about 25 cents. Success has a way of breeding expectations. In 1955, as French forces retreated from their catastrophic defeat at Dien Bien Phu, Lansdale received new orders. Do in Vietnam what you did in the Philippines. But Vietnam was not the Philippines. The Geneva Accords had split the country at the 17th parallel, creating 2 nations where none had existed before. In the north, Ho Chi Minh commanded a battle-tested government with deep popular support. In the south, there was nothing but a power vacuum and a man named Ngo Dinh Diem, a Catholic intellectual living in exile. Lansdale's mission was to create a country from scratch. Not just a government, but the entire apparatus of nationhood. Currency, constitution, military, civil service. Everything that makes a state function had to be built while communist agents worked to tear it down. His first masterstroke was Operation Passage to Freedom, the evacuation of over 1 million Catholics from North Vietnam to the south. Using a combination of genuine religious fears and carefully crafted propaganda, Lansdale convinced entire communities to abandon ancestral homes and trek southward. The operation provided Diem with a loyal population base and emptied the north of potential dissidents. But creating citizens was only part of the challenge. Lansdale also had to create a leader. Night after night, he would sit with Diem for hours, listening through translators as the austere intellectual pontificated on philosophy, governance, and Vietnamese culture. Slowly, carefully, Lansdale helped shape these monologues into a vision for the new nation. The 1956 elections were Lansdale's second triumph. Despite pressure from Diem's advisors to rig the results, Lansdale insisted on conducting them fairly. His candidate won decisively, though Diem's insistence on claiming 98% of the vote, rather than the legitimate 90%, would later fuel accusations of fraud. For a brief moment, it seemed the Philippines' miracle might be repeated. South Vietnam had a government, an identity, and hope for the future. But in the shadows, other forces were already moving to transform Lansdale's political victory into something far bloodier. January 1961. A young president named John Kennedy inherits the Bay of Pigs disaster and a burning obsession with a bearded revolutionary named Fidel Castro. The solution, Kennedy decides, lies with the man who had already toppled 2 governments using nothing but psychology and political theater. Operation Mongoose was Edward Lansdale's strangest assignment. Given unlimited resources and broad authority, he was tasked with destabilizing the Castro regime through any means short of direct military invasion. His response was characteristically creative. 33 separate plans to bring down the Cuban government. Some bordered on the fantastic. Lansdale proposed parachuting life-size dummies over Havana to simulate an invasion, spreading rumors of a second coming of Christ, accompanied by star shells launched from submarines, and contaminating Cuban sugar crops with chemicals that would make them inedible. Others were more conventional, counterfeiting Cuban currency, supporting internal dissidents, and launching propaganda campaigns designed to erode Castro's popular support. The common thread was Lansdale's belief that revolutions succeeded or failed in the minds of ordinary people, not on battlefields. But Operation Mongoose also revealed the limits of Lansdale's approach. Unlike the Philippines or South Vietnam, Cuba had a functioning government with genuine popular support. Castro wasn't a colonial puppet or an ineffective exile. He was a charismatic leader who had successfully mobilized Cuban nationalism against foreign interference. More troubling were the people Lansdale found himself working with. Bill Harvey, an alcoholic CIA operative with a fondness for extreme solutions. Johnny Roselli, a Chicago mobster with his own agenda. David Morales, a professional operative whose methods made even hardened intelligence officers uncomfortable. When Robert Kennedy ordered Lansdale to shut down unauthorized training camps in Louisiana and Florida, he discovered that some operations had taken on lives of their own. The psychological warfare expert who had once controlled every variable in his campaigns now found himself trying to contain forces he hadn't fully understood. The Bay of Pigs invasion failed. Castro remained in power, and Edward Lansdale learned that some problems couldn't be solved with clever slogans and cultural manipulation. By 1963, Edward Lansdale had become the most successful unconventional warfare specialist in American intelligence. He was also becoming the most isolated. The very qualities that made him effective, independence, creativity, disdain for hierarchy, put him on a collision course with the growing national security bureaucracy. Robert McNamara epitomized everything Lansdale despised about the new approach to warfare. The defense secretary viewed conflict through spreadsheets and statistical models, believing that sufficient firepower applied with mathematical precision could solve any problem. When Lansdale tried to brief him on Vietnamese culture and politics, McNamara would barely look up from his papers. The breaking point came during one memorable encounter. Lansdale had brought captured Vietnamese weapons to McNamara's office, rusted makeshift firearms that told the story of an enemy fighting with determination rather than sophisticated equipment. He dumped them on the defense secretary's pristine desk, mud and all. McNamara never looked up. "Don't come back here again," he said quietly. But the real tragedy wasn't personal animosity. It was strategic blindness. Lansdale understood that America was fighting a political war with military tools. The enemy recruited supporters through ideology and nationalism. American forces responded with bombing campaigns and search and destroy missions that killed civilians and created new enemies faster than bullets could eliminate old ones. The irony was devastating. Presidents who had won office through political skill, the most sophisticated practitioners of persuasion in their respective countries, abandoned politics entirely once they became commanders-in-chief. Lyndon Johnson, a master of Senate arm-twisting, personally selected bombing targets from the White House. Kennedy, who had revolutionized campaign communications, ignored the information war entirely. Meanwhile, North Vietnamese political officers held sessions after every battle, analyzing mistakes and reinforcing ideological commitment. Communist forces treated each military engagement as part of a larger political struggle. American forces treated politics as something that happened between wars. Lansdale watched his counterinsurgency principles be replaced by body counts and bombing tonnages. The war he might have won with ideas became the war America would lose with firepower. Behind the legend of the master manipulator lay a man struggling with contradictions that would have destroyed lesser figures. Edward Lansdale lived not one life but two, separated by thousands of miles and decades of carefully maintained deception. In Alexandria, Virginia, he was the devoted husband to Helen, father to their children, the picture of American suburban respectability. Helen knew he traveled frequently for work, but never questioned the long absences or the letters that arrived from distant countries. Christian Science had taught her that some mysteries were best left to faith. In the Philippines, he was someone entirely different. Pat Kelly had been his translator, his cultural guide, and eventually his great love. She was beautiful, intelligent, and understood the complexities of the work in ways Helen never could. For nearly 30 years, Lansdale maintained correspondence with both women, writing love letters that spoke of longing and permanent separation. The emotional toll was enormous. Pat eventually ended their relationship, unable to remain forever in second place to a marriage that showed no signs of ending. Lansdale was devastated, but powerless to change the fundamental architecture of his life. Like his father before him, he had chosen to live divided between two worlds, belonging fully to neither. The parallel extended beyond romance to his professional identity. In Washington, he was the outsider, the man who didn't go to Ivy League schools, didn't come from old money, didn't play by establishment rules. In Asia, he was the ultimate insider, the American who understood local culture better than most natives, who could navigate complex political relationships with intuitive skill. This duality may have been the source of both his greatest strengths and his ultimate limitations. The emotional intelligence that made him so effective at reading foreign cultures also left him vulnerable to personal contradictions he could never fully resolve. The independence that allowed him to succeed against impossible odds also isolated him from the institutional support he needed to sustain those successes. When Helen finally passed away in the early 1980s, Pat Kelly wrote to express her condolences. Within a year, she had immigrated to America and married the man she had loved for 3 decades. Their final years together were, by all accounts, deeply happy. But they came at the end of careers shaped by separation and compromise. Edward Lansdale's story should have ended with vindication. The Pentagon Papers, released in 1971, documented his warnings about the militarization of Vietnam. His predictions about the futility of conventional warfare proved accurate. His alternative approaches, ignored by McNamara and dismissed by the military establishment, offered glimpses of what might have been. But vindication is not the same as influence. When David Petraeus crafted the counterinsurgency strategy that would briefly stabilize Iraq in 2007, he explicitly cited Lansdale's work. The Anbar Awakening, turning Sunni tribal leaders against al-Qaeda, followed principles Lansdale had established in the Philippines 50 years earlier. Yet the broader lessons remained unlearned. American foreign policy continued to default to military solutions for political problems. The hearts and minds rhetoric became standard, but the resources and patience required for genuine nation-building rarely followed. Lansdale himself recognized the pattern. Called back by the Reagan administration to advise on El Salvador and Panama, he found familiar problems. Local populations caught between communist insurgents and right-wing governments. American officials who understood weapons systems better than local cultures. Strategies that treated symptoms rather than causes. The man who had once toppled governments with advertising slogans found himself reduced to teaching counterinsurgency theory at military colleges. His students listened respectfully to lectures about psychological operations and political warfare, then graduated into a system that rewarded conventional thinking and punished creative risk-taking. Perhaps the cruelest irony was literary. Lansdale had inspired characters in two of the most influential novels about American involvement in Southeast Asia: Graham Greene's The Quiet American and William Lederer's The Ugly American. Both portrayed idealistic Americans whose good intentions created unintended consequences. Both suggested that cultural misunderstanding, not malicious intent, drove foreign policy disasters. The books became bestsellers. The lessons remained unlearned. Edward Lansdale passed away in 1987, his final years spent in quiet domesticity with Pat Kelly in Virginia. The Cold War was ending, the Berlin Wall would soon fall, and the geopolitical struggles that had defined his career were becoming historical curiosities. But the fundamental questions he had raised remained as relevant as ever. Can wars be won without armies? Is it possible to export democratic values through military force? What happens when the world's most powerful military encounters enemies who fight with ideas rather than weapons? The answers played out across decades of subsequent conflicts. In Afghanistan, American forces initially succeeded by working with local allies against a common enemy, a classic Lansdale approach. The subsequent attempt to build a Western-style democracy through military occupation followed the pattern Lansdale had warned against in Vietnam. In Iraq, the initial invasion succeeded brilliantly at conventional warfare and failed catastrophically at everything that followed. The weapons of mass destruction that justified the invasion didn't exist. The democratic government that was supposed to emerge naturally required years of expensive, bloody midwifery. The hearts and minds that were supposed to welcome liberation remained stubbornly unpersuaded. These failures weren't accidents or aberrations. They were the predictable consequences of treating political problems as military challenges. They were the ghosts of Edward Lansdale's unheeded warnings, playing out in real time across multiple continents. The tragedy wasn't that America lacked the tools for effective nation-building. Lansdale had proven those tools existed and demonstrated how to use them. The tragedy was that the institutional culture of American foreign policy had no place for the patient, subtle, culturally informed approach that actually worked. In the end, Edward Lansdale's greatest victory may have been his smallest, those 25 cents that saved the Philippines. It was the proof of concept that wars could indeed be won without armies, that ideas could triumph over ideology, that understanding could defeat fanaticism. It was also a reproach to every subsequent failure to learn those lessons. What if Edward Lansdale had been listened to? What if his approach to counterinsurgency had become American doctrine rather than an interesting footnote? What if the resources spent on bombing campaigns had been invested in political warfare and cultural understanding? The questions are unanswerable but haunting. Vietnam might have ended differently. The Middle East might have seen fewer decades of conflict. The gap between American intentions and outcomes in foreign policy might not have grown so tragically wide. But asking "what if" misses the deeper lesson of Lansdale's story. The tools he developed, psychological operations, political theater, cultural manipulation, remain as relevant today as they were in the 1950s. The internet age has simply made them more powerful and more necessary. Modern conflicts are fought as much in information space as physical space. Victory goes not to the side with superior firepower, but to the side that better understands how ideas spread, how loyalties form, and how narratives shape reality. Edward Lansdale pioneered these techniques when they required face-to-face conversations and handwritten letters. Today's practitioners work with algorithms and social media platforms, but the fundamental principles remain unchanged. The man who could win wars without armies understood something his contemporaries missed and his successors forgot. In the end, all wars are fought inside human minds. The side that wins those battles wins everything that follows. Edward Lansdale spent his career proving that truth. The world spent the decades after his passing learning it the hard way. Perhaps it's time to remember what he tried to teach us, that the most powerful weapon in any conflict isn't manufactured in factories or launched from aircraft carriers. It's manufactured in the space between human ears, one conversation at a time, one convert at a time, one heart and mind at a time. In a world still struggling with insurgencies, terrorism, and ideological conflict, that lesson has never been more important to remember.